Hello, I'm Rowland Keable, and I just basically do round earth. But when I was asked to do this slot, it was at the beginning of some people talking about an international, like what's happening beyond our borders as well. And so I'm going to try and talk about the way that I've thought about things, about strategy, and the way that using the international scene and strategy kind of come together. One of the things that we're... Sorry, can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Yeah? One of the things that I'm extremely conscious of is that I'm incredibly old. And that actually people try to come in and start doing what I did when I started, it's very difficult. And the whole point about EBUK is to make the situation easier for somebody coming in at that point. And so there's always this tension with that between this international work and thinking about things strategically in that way, and also being able to act at a local level. If I were to set up as a builder in some way in Devon now, with the expectation that I could keep going in Devon, maybe go across the border to Somerset for a couple of jobs, I think it would be quite difficult. And so EBUK's job, I think for me, is to try and make that a possibility. And because I'm so ancient, I feel it's sort of incumbent on me to make those possibilities easier for those people. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about which will be partly sort of talking about sort of my own trajectory in time. Yeah, it really doesn't work with the light, does it? But so I'm sorry, but this is the first building that I was involved with in 1985. Freetown, Sierra Leone. Had the book from 1920. We had no power. We had no. We would go to the shop over the road for some water. It was everything was difficult about it, and that's really what hooked me in, was that everything about it was difficult, and we managed to produce a building at a cost and prove that cost. And the whole kind of the strategy at that point, the overarching thing was low-cost housing. Low-cost housing is a really lousy idea because while everybody would like to live in a house that doesn't cost too much, calling it low-cost housing is like saying it's got the pox. Right? Nobody wants to live in a low-cost house. And as soon as you say earth and low cost, you've immediately you're lost. So that's where we started, and it went on for a number of years. Then at the beginning of the 90s, we won a contract with British government, DFID, to write a description of what we were doing, because we kept on asking them, look, you're building schools and you're building clinics in all these different places, and you're just doing these conventional materials. Why can't you think about using materials which are there? And they said, we don't know what you're talking about. So we said, okay, can you fund us to write a description? And that description became what we then saw as a code of practice. So it's written in a sort of a standard format with a guide, tests, and then a standard for each particular item. And it was written with, the funding said this is about Africa. So the maps inside are of Africa. And we brought a big container load of laterite from Ghana, which we made arches out of and did other things and so on. And that was published in 1986. And we called it a code of practice, but we had no real picture about how it would become a standard. So it was just sort of coincidence that I'd then gone to Zimbabwe to set up in a slightly different way than I'd worked before, where we'd gone in and done pilot projects to build something, and look at the costs and then come away. The sort of parachute operation. And I thought, no, that doesn't work. You've actually got to base yourself in one place for a while and build up a bit more of a body of work and a group of people. So that's what I sort of started doing in 95. This was published in 96. And we, at that point, got some more money from DFID to build a classroom. And classrooms is going to be like a little theme that's just going to run through this. Because classrooms are about children. Children have no sense that cement is the answer to all of their problems. And if you can take a child and show them Earth, that they sit in the only sort of state building that they will regularly interact with throughout their childhood, then their sense is, oh yes, an Earth building can work. If it's always a concrete building, then their sense is concrete is the way to go, right? It's quite basic thinking. But we got this money to build a classroom block in Malawi. And Malawi is a very particular place where they hadn't built schools for 30 years, so there was an enormous need. And they've put a lot of money, British government, German government, Bill Gates, etc. and so on. And so we went and we looked at the Malawian situation and we talked to people on the ground there. And when I said, I've got this money, could I have a site? I want to build a classroom to prove the costs. They said, there's the airport. Yeah, literally, it's the whole setup between the state and its regulations say that the school is always an urban area. So you will follow the building code, which we wrote as Britain in 1957. It's still the same, it hasn't changed. And that situation is the same across all of Anglophone Africa, probably Francophone Africa, Lusophone, and so on. All of these things are just set there in concrete. Start a building, dig a hole, pour in some concrete. So we had the money, and so this classroom actually we built in Zimbabwe because we'd built these relationships there and we'd started. And through that process, we took the newly minted Code of Practice to the Standards Association of Zimbabwe and said, can we make this into a national standard? And there was just a bit of good luck and timing that they had a new boss, and she said, yes, this is what we should be doing with standards. And the thing about writing a standard is that it takes time. This took 4 years. We started in 97, and it was published in 2001. It's quite a laborious process. You have to go through every line of the document. You've got a group of people drawn from academia and industry and the ministries and so on, and everything has to be tested again, and so there are costs involved and time and all of these things. But nevertheless, this was published in 2001, and by that point I was already back in the UK, and the first user was the Minister of Education in Zimbabwe. Built a school in her own constituency. Right? And at that point, I suddenly had a different view about what I'd been doing with this standards thing. Because up until that point, politicians are kind of the enemy, right? They just put things in the way. If you give them a technical document at a certain level, they can use it. They're not technical people, they're politicians. They want votes, right? So they can build their school cheaper in their constituency, get a few more votes, because you've given them the technical ability to do so. So I suddenly thought, right, standards are actually quite an interesting thing. Now, I left school at 16, okay? So the idea that I would be standing here so many years later, enthusing to you about standards is kind of funny in a way, because that was not really where I come from, and it's not really why I went into earth building. But I've just seen over time the influence of some of these things, and it's become like a strategic thing that one can see if you do this, something else can happen. If you do that, something else can happen. Your change, you've got these, so strategically, you've got these two things that go along. You can change things one building at a time. You build a building, and people can see it, and they can look at it, and they can touch it, and they can experience it, and it's absolutely vital. And you can change the conditions that you build buildings in, and that's done through pieces of paper, right? And these two things has to go along like that. So, 2000, I met Pete, and we had a bit of a chat. He went to Zimbabwe and to Australia. I went to Australia and Zimbabwe. We had this sort of common thing. I'm the sort of practitioner, he's the academic, and it was a very good partnership to think about how to do the same exercise again that we'd done at the beginning of the 90s to write a guideline here. Now, this isn't a standard, okay, because it hasn't been taken up by British standards or anybody else. It's a guideline. Nevertheless, it has power. People ring me up and they say, we have your book. You know, engineers ring me up and they say, we have your book, we've looked at this book and it says this, and that's the basis upon which they proceed, okay? And so, even without being an official document, it kind of becomes a de facto official document until the next one comes. You know, Paul then produces a book, and then that becomes the next de facto document, and so on. And I'll do anything, you know, at this point. I'll get it onto Brianne. If it gets it on the list, it becomes the choice, something that someone can choose. It's a thing you either, it's there on the page or it's not there on the page. There's criticism of Brianne, of the process, etc., and so on. Okay, fine, but it's still something that people refer to and defer to. Okay, Brandurf's on there. We're still waiting for coal. It will come, it needs to come. And the extruded bricks and all of those other things. This is a classroom that we finished a couple of years ago. And so the first classroom kind of grew out of writing the code of practice. The second classroom kind of grew out of the guideline. It's one of a number of classrooms we built in East Sussex. Paul Mallion is sitting over there, designed it as a passive house design, although it's not certified. But it's kind of using materials in an innovation way, putting different insulation materials, detailing, designing, and so on in a modern UK regulated way. But it is also a classroom. Strategically, for me, the thing has been to build public buildings. I've just seen that public buildings are things that the public go into, and houses are things that typically you go into and your friends, and that's it. So strategically, if you want buildings to be seen, then public buildings are good buildings to build. And schools in particular, because children go into them. And it's a really funny thing, this whole schools thing, because people are absolutely terrified of their children being in a room with some earth, right? Again, all of these things takes a bit of time to shift. This building was built by a non-specialist contractor who has followed the East Sussex County Council tendering process up against 5 other named contractors. Paul and I were brought in as consultants underneath the consultants who were on a list of named consultants on the East Sussex County Council list, who had been asked to produce more of these classrooms after we produced the first one. And of course they didn't know anything about it, so they call us in to tell them something about it. And then it goes to the main contractor, and the main contractor does it. And you may know or not, but typically contractors will say that they can do anything and everything, and that they're extremely careful about everything, and it may or may not be the case. And in this case, it was a very interesting case in point because we were building 3 classrooms which are all basically identical on 3 different sites with 3 different site agents. And the quality of the site agent made a really big difference about how each of them was completed on time or not, in the weather, etc. and so on. And all sorts of things that when you go into this thing where you're opening the technology to a wider, I'd say audience, but I mean audience of professionals, groups of architects and engineers, groups of contractors, groups of individual workers on sites. Once that happens, you give up, of course, a massive amount of control. And it's a sort of deal with the devil, right? But somehow I feel that we need to experiment with these things to find out what is the limit of possibility. Because, I mean, Barbara said there is something about touching it and experiencing it and knowing something about it. What are some of those limits? So when you come back on site, you find that they, instead of drilling a hole through the wall like that and putting the wiring around the outside of the building where the insulation is, with a rain screen over the side, they've just put some steel pipes down the wall and it's just a crappy detail, you know, but you sort of think they didn't have to do that. But you give up that control, okay? But that's a strategic decision. So that's going on. How much do you think? Oh God, I'm really going to move now because. So that's going on, and the Zimbabwe Code has sat there for some years, and I went back to the Zimbabweans and said we would like to take that code to other countries in the region, and they said, okay. But you have to do it to all of the countries in the region, to an economic bloc called the Southern African Development Community. This is the introductory page of the Zimbabwe Code as transposed for SADC into Portuguese for Angola and Mozambique. This is a process now where you're not writing a standard, you are harmonizing a standard. You are taking a standard and giving it to a group of different countries that has an agreement. And all of these agreements exist, and they're all driven by ISO-type processes, which are driven in turn by national stakeholders. The Architects Association, the Engineers Institute, the University of Lusaka, etc. and so on, in all of these different countries. And you have to mobilize each of these groups of stakeholders in each of these different countries. So in 5 years, we now have 15 countries with a Round Earth standard. Round Earth is clearly not the answer to all of these countries' building problems, but it is a really good strategic foot in the door. It's now very difficult for all of those countries to turn around and say, you can't make earth bricks, okay? Because we've kind of set up a precedent. Yeah? So these are all things that move us forward a little bit. And from that, this is a classroom block that we've just been building in Zambia, very remote sites in Zambia. And I heard 2 days ago that the government, the Ministry of Education, has sent a paid government teacher to teach in this school. It is an earth school that follows the Zambian national standard on round earth structures. That is the effect that this whole standards thing happens. And you can see that there's this relationship going backwards and forwards between here and there and back again, building up these levels of experience and these kind of interlocking structures of standards. Okay? It's really significant. There's no earth school in Zambia other than this that has a paid ministry teacher. And that has a big impact on what people can do. And so going on, we then look to our own national structure again to say, what do we have a national structure? No, we need to start a national structure to bring about these changes, which goes back to the beginning again, people coming in at 22 and saying, I want to do this, how do I do this? How do we remove barriers and allow that to happen? And through EBUK, we now have a partnership with European partners who've already delivered a training standard for earth plasters. We're now working on the next project we've just started on earth structures. And this is not about academia, this is about my sort of fantasy that I will go onto site in 10 years and with a regular contractor, and I'll say, right, what we're doing here now with your team is starting to build some round earth walls, and someone will go, yeah, we've done the clay unit at the technical college when we were also doing concrete block and bricklaying. Okay, that's the sort of fantasy for me that people are actually exposed to earth, you know, as just a normal part of their education, that it lowers these barriers. So we've just started on that, and I know there's like a million things that I should be adding and saying more about that, but I've just been given my 1 minute warning. I will do anything. I will go on Facebook. You have to do everything. You have to even go on Facebook, okay? You have to just push all the time, at every level. You know, postdoctorates and the guy with the shovel and everything in between has to be touched and done. There is no conflict between academia and practice. Everything needs to be done. And two more things that needs to be done, and this is my proposal. There is a very generic standard which the Americans wrote and published a couple of years ago, an ASTM on earth structures. And basically what it says is, if you've got some earth and you've got some technology, bricks, blocks, cob, whatever it might be, you can follow this and you can justify that to your local authority, and you don't then need this specialist route always of the engineer and the engineer's insurance. And it's something that we don't have to rewrite. We can, through our own stakeholder pressure, we can pressure British standards to harmonise this standard across. There are other standards. There's a DIN standard and so on. This one's in English. I talked about inches, but yeah. And it's like the round earth in southern Africa. It's a foot in the door. It's a way to open. It's not the last word in standards. It's the first word, and we have to. We're not going to get rid of concrete standards and all of these things, and we will always be measured against them, and we actually have to deal with it. I'm sorry to say. Okay. It's my last slide. Okay. We had our first national meeting of the Monolithic Structures for the European training program yesterday. We had a fantastic day. We sat in a room with half a dozen long experienced cob builders from Scotland to Cornwall. Okay? And we went through every process that you have to make, from talking to the client at one end to making sure that the roof is detailed nicely at the other, and all of the other elements that go to make a cob wall. We spent the whole day talking about it, and at no point in the whole day did anybody say, well, of course, you have to put cement in. Now, I'm in the unfortunate position of having taken up round earth rather than cob, okay? And in the round earth world, there is a general conception that round earth is something that has cement in. If you look at any website in California, Australia, South Africa, and it says this is round earth, what you're looking at is concrete. It is concrete. It's got between 5 and 13% cement in it. It is concrete. It is not earth. The binder is not clay, and it is not earth. I'm sorry, I've said it before, and I will say it again. And what this represents, all right, is a European process, a process where we can, as stakeholders and with European partners, set a standard about what something is. This is a Jaffa cake, or is it a biscuit? Right? I can hear the Daily Mail screaming headline, you know, hippies say Earth is Earth. Shock. Right? But there is a European process for saying something is Earth if it's Earth. Right? And that is something that I feel that as EBUK, as a way of helping these people coming in at 22, we need to actually draw a line and say, that is Earth, that is concrete. Thank you very much.